Okay, so you're thinking about picking up Hatchet, the classic by Gary Paulsen.
A great choice. It's definitely a classic for a reason.
But with so many books out there, especially survival stories, you need to know, is it really worth your time?
Exactly. There are definitely some things you should know before diving in.
Well, that's what we're here for. In this deep dive, we're going to cut through the hype Hatchet style and help you decide if Hatchet deserves a spot on your reading list.
Sounds good to me.
Perfect. Now, for those who might not be familiar, super quick recap. Hatchet is about 13-year-old Brian,
Right, 13-year-old Brian.
who finds himself stranded in the Canadian wilderness,
After a plane crash.
alone with nothing but a hatchet to help him survive.
And believe me, he needs all the help he can get.
So the question is, will he make it? Well, to answer that, let's start by talking about the writing style.
Okay, so the writing style. This is where things get a little interesting, actually.
Interesting, how so?
Well, because opinions are really divided. Some readers find Paulsen's writing style poetic and gripping.
Right, I can see that. Pulling you right into Brian's struggle.
Exactly. But on the other hand, a lot of people find it overly simplistic and repetitive, like really repetitive.
Ouch. I mean, I get it. Nobody likes to feel like they're reading the same thing over and over again.
Yeah, and for some readers, it can be a major turnoff. In fact, I was just looking at some Goodreads reviews earlier, and one reviewer actually said the repetition made her want to pull her hair out.
Yikes. Well, that's not a good sign. Can you give us an example of what they mean by repetitive? Like, what are we talking about here?
Sure. So there are passages where Paulsen describes Brian's thoughts and actions, very basically, almost like a monotonous way. For example, there's this one scene where Brian is trying to make fire.
Okay, super important for survival, right?
Absolutely crucial. And Paulsen really emphasizes Brian's persistence. He'll keep repeating phrases like, he tried, and tried, and tried again.
Yeah. Oh, I can see how that could get old after a while, especially if you're someone who prefers more, I don't know, nuanced writing. But what about the story itself? I mean, is the plot engaging enough to maybe overlook a slightly repetitive writing style?
Okay, so the plot itself is undeniably gripping. I mean, the whole survival aspect is just fascinating. It keeps you on the edge of your seat. And you really see Brian transform from this kind of scared kid who can barely build a fire into a resourceful survivor. He learns to hunt, to fish, to build shelter, the whole 9 yards.
So he's got that classic hero's journey, right?
Yeah.
Where he overcomes adversity and comes out stronger on the other side.
Exactly. It's a classic for a reason. And Paulsen does a fantastic job of showcasing Brian's ingenuity. Like there's this one part where he figures out how to make fire by observing a porcupine.
A porcupine. How does a porcupine help you make fire?
Well, he sees the porcupine rubbing its quills against a dry log, and that sparks an idea. He's like, aha, friction creates fire.
That's pretty clever. Resourceful little guy, huh?
He is. And then there's another scene where he manages to retrieve supplies from the submerged airplane.
Wait, the plane? I thought that crashed.
It did. But after a tornado, it ends up partially submerged in a lake. And Brian has to figure out a way to get to it and salvage what he can.
Okay, so not only does he have to survive the initial crash, but he's also dealing with the aftermath and, like, crazy weather events. That poor kid. But those parts do sound pretty exciting. I gotta admit, I'm kind of hooked already. But I'm curious about Brian's character on a deeper level. Does he have, like, emotional depth?
Yeah.
Or is he just a survival machine?
That's a good question, and there's definitely some emotional depth to Brian. But I'd say it's underdeveloped. We learn about his parents' divorce.
Oh, so there's some family drama going on in the background.
Yeah, and there's this secret he's carrying about his mother's infidelity.
Wow, that's some heavy stuff for a 13-year-old to be dealing with.
Exactly. And while it adds another layer to the story, it's not fully explored. Almost feels like a missed opportunity.
Right, right. Okay, so we've got a compelling survival plot, potentially repetitive writing, a somewhat underdeveloped emotional subplot. What about the ending? Fill us in.
Ah, yes, the ending. Probably the most controversial aspect of the book.
I've heard it described as abrupt. True.
It's one way to put it. It is abrupt. In the original version, it basically just ends with Brian being rescued. Like, boom, rescue, the end, and that's it.
Oh, wow. After everything he went through, that does seem kind of anticlimactic.
Right. A lot of readers felt unsatisfied, wanting more closure. It actually sparked so much discussion, even controversy, that Paulsen eventually caved to fan pressure. He ended up writing several sequels.
With a different storyline.
Yeah.
So he basically rewrote the ending.
Pretty much. It's wild, right? Shows you the power of readers sometimes.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about the writing style, the plot, the characters, and the super controversial ending. But let's step back for a second. and compare Hatchet to other survival stories out there. What sets it apart besides the unique ending?
That's a great question. I think what makes Hatchet stand out is the combination of Brian's age, the setting, and that focus on his psychological journey. You're really seeing the world through the eyes of a 13-year-old who's struggling to survive in a pretty harsh environment.
So it's that unique perspective that draws readers in.
Absolutely. It's very raw, very real. You really feel Brian's fear and desperation.
Okay, so how does it compare to some other classics in the genre, like Island of the Blue Dolphins or My Side of the Mountain?
Great examples. In Island of the Blue Dolphins, the protagonist, Karana, she's older than Brian, and she's already pretty skilled in survival techniques. So it's more about her resilience and adaptation to a solitary life.
Okay, so different focus, but still survival at its core.
Exactly. Now, with My Side of the Mountain, the focus is more on self-sufficiency, living in harmony with nature.
So a little bit more idyllic.
You could say that. Definitely less about the raw struggle for survival that you see in Hatchet.
Okay, so Hatchet stands out for its intensity and that very specific perspective. But what's the main takeaway for someone who's considering reading it?
Well, I'd say that Hatchet is a good read for younger audiences, definitely. Anyone who loves survival stories. It's quick, impactful. I mean, it's won numerous awards, including a Newbery Honor, so there's a reason it's considered a classic.
Makes sense. But it sounds like it's not for everyone. Like, what if I'm someone who prefers more complex writing? Stories that really dig deep into the character's emotions.
You bring up a good point. That's where it gets tricky. If you're not into simplistic writing or you're looking for something super emotionally nuanced, then Hatchet might not be the best fit for you. There are definitely other survival stories out there that might be a better match.
Got it. So Hatchet's raw, it's gripping, but it's not trying to be a deep emotional saga.
Exactly. It's all about the survival.
Okay, so we've covered a lot about the book itself, the writing style, the plot, the characters, that abrupt ending.
Right, we've hit all the main points.
Now I'm curious. I mean, Hatchet has been around for a while.
Yeah, it was originally published back in 1987.
So why do you think it continues to resonate with readers even today? I mean, what's the lasting appeal?
I think part of it is just the power of a good survival story, right?
Yeah, those are always popular. People love to see how someone overcomes incredible odds.
Exactly. And Paulsen just does such a great job of putting you right there in the wilderness with Brian.
I can imagine. All those sensory details, the descriptions of the forest, the animals, even the hunger and thirst that Brian experiences.
It's all very vivid and immersive. You can practically feel the mosquitoes biting, the sun beating down on you.
Oh, for sure. I bet those mosquitoes are brutal. But I think you're right. It's that immersive quality that makes Hatchet stand out.
It's not just reading a story. It's like experiencing it firsthand.
And that experience, that connection with Brian's struggle, it makes the story that much more impactful.
Absolutely. And I think it also taps into that primal instinct we all have.
Yeah.
That desire to survive, to overcome challenges.
Right. It makes you think about what you would do in a similar situation. Speaking of which, I've been wondering about this. If I were stranded in the wilderness like Brian, what one everyday item would I wish I had? Besides the obvious stuff like a satellite phone or a GPS.
That's a great question. It really makes you think about all those things we take for granted. For me, I think it would have to be a good multi-tool.
Oh, smart choice. Something with a knife, a saw, pliers, all that good stuff.
Yeah, a real Swiss Army knife situation. It would be so versatile.
Totally. I mean, think about all the things Brian had to create from scratch. A multi-tool would have made his life a lot easier.
No kidding.
So, a multi-tool for you. What about you? What one item would you bring?
Oh, man, that's a tough one. I'm kind of torn between a water purifier and a really good fire starter.
Interesting. I can see the appeal of both. Clean water is essential, obviously.
Right, you can't survive without it.
But then fire is so important, too.
Right.
For warmth, for cooking, for protection.
Yeah, tough call. But I think I'd go with the fire starter.
Ooh, good choice. Fire can definitely be a lifesaver in a survival situation.
Not to mention, it's just comforting. Having a fire going gives you a sense of security, of hope.
Definitely. It's like a symbol of civilization in the midst of the wilderness.
Right. It's interesting to think about how Brian managed to create fire using only natural resources.
Yeah, that was pretty impressive. He really had to use his brain.
Talk about resourcefulness. Definitely something to admire.
It is. It makes you realize that we all have that potential within us, to adapt, to overcome challenges, to be resourceful.
Yeah, sometimes it just takes a little push.
Or a plane crash in the Canadian wilderness, apparently.
Well, hopefully it won't come to that for any of us.
Fingers crossed. But I think that's a great point to end on. Hatchet ultimately reminds us of the incredible resilience of the human spirit. Well, I think after this deep dive into Hatchet, our listeners have a pretty good grasp of what this book is all about. Its strengths, its weaknesses, why it continues to resonate with readers even today.
I agree. I think we've covered a lot of ground. We've touched on a lot of different aspects of this story.
We have. But before we wrap things up, I want to leave our listeners with something to ponder. We talked about what we would bring to the wilderness, right? Like if we were in Brian's shoes.
Right, right. Our must-have survival items.
Exactly. But what about you, listening right now? If you were stranded like Brian, what one everyday item would you wish you had?
Ooh, that's a great question to leave our listeners with. Really gets those wheels turning.
Exactly. So, dear listeners, head over to our social media, share your thoughts, your must-have wilderness item, using the hashtag #DeepDiveHatchet.
Yeah, we definitely want to hear from you. What would you bring?
We can't wait to see what you come up with. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep into the world of literature.
And survival stories.